Tremendous chut to be here today on Shavas B'Tammuz. And as we know, Chazal teach us to always open b'chvod hachsanya, to thank the host. So in this case, I have to give a very special thank you to Jesse, who is extremely, as I told him, positively persevering in ensuring that both myself and Rav Taragin, my husband, would be able to share some Torah with you today. But I have to say that even more impressed by his persistence, I'm impressed by your participation. To come here from morning till evening, and Minchan Arvit Be'ezrat Hashem, Ana Ta'anit in the summer, to learn all day. On one hand, I can't say that there's anything more appropriate to do, and yet at the same time to say thank you. Thank you for coming and allowing us to share words of Torah and to transform today into a very meaningful day. And at the same time, on the whole way here, I was telling my husband and how excited I am to see so many familiar faces, to come and learn with you again as we did last year, to wish a mazal tov to Tamar on her engagement. And I said, when one is so excited, and the bracha, the Chazal tell us that we're supposed to recite is Shechiyanu v'kimanu v'gianu lazman hazeh. But the Shulchan Aruch says that you're not supposed to say this during the 3 weeks. So I'm going to say it without Shem and Malchut. Shechiyanu v'kimanu v'gianu lazman hazeh. And now without further ado then, we're going to start by speaking about what Chazal tell us is really the focus of the day, namely to think about the 5 different events that occurred on Shavas B'Tammuz. And this is what got me thinking with regard to the different events that we're supposed to be commemorating, and how on one hand, each one stands alone, and yet there are various parallels between them, one that I'd like to point out and really focus on today. The Mishnah in Tani tells us, Chamisha dvarim iru et avotenu b'Shavas B'Tammuz. There were 5 different events, one can even say crises, that occurred to our forefathers on this date, which was actually yesterday, but Shavas B'Tammuz, and 5 on Tisha B'Av. And this in itself is a very interesting method that Chazal incorporate in teaching us various ideas, partially as a mnemonic, to ensure that we remember 5 events Shavas B'Tammuz, and therefore 5 on Tisha B'Av as well. And even though they may not all seem to be of the same level of aggravation, perhaps even of loss, we're nonetheless supposed to think and commemorate them. What are they? B'Shavas B'Tammuz nishtabru haluchot. The first set of luchot were broken by Moshe Rabbeinu. Ubatel hatamid, and the karban tamid. Unclear whether this is a reference to the karban tamid during the time of the first Beit HaMikdash or the second Beit HaMikdash. V'huvka ha'ir, and the city walls were breached through, which, as we know, led directly to the Chorban Beit HaMikdash. And we're going to see the Gemara, the Yerushalmi, is going to expound upon this. V'saraf apostamos et haTorah, v'hemit selam v'hechal. Also very unclear whether this is a reference to Menashe, who placed an idol in the Beit HaMikdash, or perhaps to the Greeks, or maybe even the Romans thereafter. So even as we look at these 5 different events, and we notice how on one hand they're different one from the other, and at the same time, what's common is not only the tragic aspect, but also that it wasn't the end, that something could have happened. And the truth is that in the case of the luchot, we know that there was a second set of luchot. So we're going to try to understand, particularly with regard to the first one that's mentioned, also a chronological one, nishtabru haluchot, what this is a reference to, and then we're going to speak about a parallel that I think is apparent through the Mishnah itself. The Talmud Yerushalmi expounds upon each one and explains what is the story of Shvirat Haluchot. What is so terrible about Shvirat Haluchot? Well, this all started immediately after Ma'amad Har Sinai. Vayishkon kvar Hashem al Har Sinai, vayachase Yohanan sheshet yamim, vayikra el Moshe bayom hashvi'i vayal Moshe. Immediately after the sound and light show of Ma'amad Har Sinai, Hashem calls Moshe up to Har Sinai, telling him that he's going to give him Luchot, Torah, HaMitzvah, Shvi'i lachar dibrot, 7 days from the time that all of Am Yisrael heard the 10 Commandments, V'tchila la'arba'im, and this is going to be the beginning, though, of 40 days that Moshe remains atop of Har Sinai. Amar lahen Moshe, and Moshe turned to Bnei Yisrael and said, I am now going up to Har Sinai for 40 days. Kevan shigia yom arba'im v'lo ba. But 40 days after, Moshe still isn't back. Miyad vayar ha'am ki boshesh Moshe laredet min ha'har. Am Yisrael immediately upon seeing that Moshe is delayed, what did they do? כיוון שהגיע 6 שעות ולא בא, 6 hours they waited for him, but he still didn't come. מיד ויקל העם על אהרון. ויאמרו אליו, קום עשה לנו אלוהים אשר ילכו לפנינו. And the various Parshanim debate, what is it that Am Yisrael, after the amazing manifestation of God by Har Sinai, what were they seeking to do? Were they really seeking to replace Moshe Rabbeinu? And it seems that they weren't even seeking an alternate to God. They had just witnessed the glory of Hashem by Har Sinai. Rather, it seems that they want to create their own Mishkan, their own means of an ongoing revelation of Hashem. And therefore, the irony is that while they're going to encourage Aaron to help create a Ma'aseh Merkava in the form of a golden calf, some symbol of the presence of God, Hashem actually is commanding Moshe Rabbeinu to do the same. Asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. So what went wrong? Am Yisrael are creating something beautiful, a perpetual means of experiencing the revelation of Hashem. But what happens? Vayidaber Hashem Moshe, lech reid ki shecheitamcha. Hashem says the people have become corrupted. Vayishma Yoshu et kol ha'am b'ra'ah. Vayomer Moshe, kol melchama b'machaneh. I hear the sound of war. And Moshe says, in the future, you're going to lead the people. You have to be able to distinguish between the sound of war and the sound of folly. He says, this is not the sound of war. Ein kolonot gvura ve'ein kolonot chalusha, kol onot anochi shomea. Amar Rav Yosef, kol kilus akum anochi shomea. Moshe was alluding to the sounds that he was hearing of Avodah Zarah. Rav Yudim b'shem Rav Yosef, Ein kol dor vador she'en bo unke achad michet shel ha'egel. And we're still suffering, basically, from the same sin of the egel. Vayhi kasher karav al ha'machaneh. But back to our story. When Moshe then came back to the machaneh, vayaret ha'egel, the Torah states he didn't just see the egel. He saw the egel, v'mecholot, and the dancing around the egel. Rav Chilkia b'shem Rav Acha, mikan shelo yeh adam. Dan umadot, darash Moshe mikal v'chomer, and Moshe himself engaged in an extrapolatory method of teaching. He said, I know already, God said, that the Pesach, Karban Pesach, is a mitzvah taseh that is given to the individual. Kol arei lo yochal bo min haTorah, shekol hamitzvot klulot ba. And anyone who's uncircumcised is not allowed to participate in the eating. Kal v'chomer, he says, al achat kama v'kama. Look at what Am Yisrael have done. They have now transgressed against one of the dibrot. Lo yelach Elohim achirim al panai. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, so what do they deserve for that? Well, if an uncircumcised person is cut off from Am Yisrael, vayichar af Moshe, vayashlech miadav et haluchot, vayishaber odham tachat hahar. Moshe says, I'm going to have to destroy the contract that was arranged between Hashem and Bnei Yisrael. If God literally wrote down the terms of the contract on the luchot, on these tablets, then Am Yisrael have broken these terms. Tani Rabbi Yishmael, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Amar Lo Sheyishberem. And it wasn't just Moshe. Hashem had actually told him. How do we know this? V'achtov al haluchot et ha'dvarim asher hayu al haluchot harishonim asher shibarta. Because when Moshe is going to write the second set of luchot, Hashem says, yes, I want you to write them like the first ones that you broke, and Hashem doesn't criticize him. Amar lo yafeh asita sheshibarta. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was happy that Moshe had broken these luchot. Or as Chazal say elsewhere, yasher koach al sheshibarta. Rav Shmuel Bar Nachman b'shem Rabbi Yonatan explains that the luchot were actually of an enormous weight. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu was able to make it easier for Moshe because the ktav, the writing itself, made the tablets miraculously lightweight. But what happens? As soon as Bnei Yisrael sins with the calf, Bikesh HaKadosh Baruch Hu lochotzvan miyado shel Moshe. It's almost as if Moshe and Hashem were fighting over the luchot, and Hashem says, I want my luchot back, not intending that Moshe would necessarily break them, that they would be shattered. V'gavra yado shel Moshe. A very interesting term. Moshe's hands were stronger. Moshe says, no, you're not taking this away from me. On the contrary, I'm going to hold on to the contract, and I'm going to show Bnei Yisrael that they broke it. V'chatafan ulachol hayad chazaka. This was Moshe's very strong hand. The strong hand that could hold the luchot when the words of God were still contained within. But as soon as the people sinned, as soon as Moshe saw not the egel, but the dancing, the frolicking around the egel, which was a form of avodah zarah, that's when the otiot, the letters, are going to leave, and only the weight of the stone is left. V'naflu v'nishtabru. And Moshe breaks the luchot. That is the story, as Chazal understand the pshat of the psukim that we're going to see in just a moment. And then the Gemara elaborates on the next event that's mentioned, Ubatel HaTamid. Apparently, the chronological order, sometime during the time of the first Beit HaMikdash, they can no longer bring the Karban Tamid. V'hufka'a ha'ir, and the city was breached through during the time of the siege. Chazal here explain as well, Hufka'a ha'ir, this is not only during the time of the second Beit HaMikdash, but also during the time of the first Beit HaMikdash. But if we look at the second source on the page in Yirmiyahu Perek Lametet, we hear that Yirmiyahu, a Navi during the first temple era, describes what went on prior to the destruction, and he describes how in the 11th year of Tzidkiyahu, the final king over Yerushalayim in the time of the first Commonwealth, B'chodesh harivi'i b'tish'a lachodesh hufka'a ha'ir. He says it explicitly. On what date was the city broken through? Not on the 17th, but on the 9th. So the Yerushalmi explains, no, it was really the 17th, but rather there was a kilkul cheshbonot yeshkan. But there was a distortion of the date. Why? Because all one has to do is open up Sefer Yirmiyahu, and one will be exposed to the most anachronistic Sefer, in the sense of a Sefer that is completely achronological, beginning in the time of Yoshiyahu, and then skipping to the time of Yehoyakim, and later on to Tzidkiyahu, back to Yehoyakim time period, the first years of Yehoyakim, the 4th year of Yehoyakim, then to Tzidkiyahu, back and forth. And the reason why Chazal have preserved the achronological aspect of Yirmiyahu is to give us a sense of the chaos, to give us a sense of the complete quandary that Yirmiyahu and the entire people are during that time. Just as I ask people in camp all the time, does anyone know what the date is? So Baruch Hashem, today we know that it's not really Shavas B'Tammuz, it's Yud Chet B'Tammuz. But other than that, I generally don't know the date. Certainly not the English dates, which is? It is? Yes? Okay, thank you very much, which is the 24th, because our minds are preoccupied with other events, perhaps, that are going on. You can imagine then, during the time of the Churban Beit HaMikdash, the 9th, the 17th, and Chazal preserve this, explain Rav Kook, in order not to lose a sense of the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, the Moshav HaChayim, to get a sense of what's known as the Zitzim Leiben, how the people were actually living during that time. They were in a state of despair, and therefore when we think of Hufka'a Ha'ir, we should think of both the prelude to the Churban Beit HaMikdash HaRishon and Beit HaMikdash HaSheni. If we look on the top of page 2, we hear that even though it was recorded as the 9th, it's really the 17th. And how do we know that? Because Yirmiyahu saw a makel shaked that we spoke about last year. Yirmiyahu saw and the staff made out of almond wood. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu said that, Heitafta l'rot ki shakadati al dvari la'asoto. I'm going to give the makel. I'm going to strike the people just like a shaked, which blossoms over the course of 21 days. The 21 days of Bein HaMitzarim from now until Tisha B'Av. And therefore, explains the Yerushalmi, both the prelude to the first destruction and the second occurred on Shavas B'Tammuz. And then the Gemara goes on to explain each one of the other dates that are alluded to in Sefer Zechariah, not only Tzom HaRevi'i and Tzom HaChamishi, but also Tzom HaShvi'i of Tzom Gedalia, and Tzom HaAsiri, a machloket between Rabbi Akiva and Chachamim, the 5th of Tevet, Asara B'Tevet. But what struck me as I looked at the Mishnah, and certainly the Gemara, is that there are only 2 events out of the list of 5 that occur to a certain degree in pairs. And by that I mean both Shvirat Haluchot, we have a set of, or 2 sets really, of tablets, and Hufka'a Ha'ir, which the Gemara explains, just like we're going to see and commemorate on Tisha B'Av, also occurs twice. We have 2 tablets and 2 temples. And maybe Chazal, in placing the tragedy of both on the same date, maybe they're trying to tell us look at these two and try to recognize not only parallels between them, but try to appreciate the tragedy of what we're speaking about. And on one hand, you're thinking, but we had 2 temples that were destroyed. We didn't have 2 tablets that were destroyed. 1 tablet was destroyed, and ironically, even after it was destroyed, Moshe Rabbeinu was told to take those broken tablets and keep them in the Aron. And then, there's a second set of tablets. Nonetheless, though, there really are 2 sets. 2 tablets and 2 temples. And we're going to explore then the first and the second luchot to try to appreciate the relationship between them. And then we're going to continue and explore the relationship between the first and the second temples. So we begin with revisiting the story that the Gemara was making reference to in Shmot Perek Lamed Bet. Vayar ha'am ki boshesh Moshe laredet min hahar vayakel ha'am al Aharon. The people are so excited after Ma'amad Har Sinai. They see Moshe going up to a cloud of glory. They see Moshe to a certain degree being somewhat consumed by fire, enveloped by this manifestation of God. And therefore, they want to create an ongoing means of perpetuating this revelation. And not only do they revisit Har Sinai by literally bringing olot and bringing zvachim, but when we look at Pasuk Hey, Vayar Aaron, Vayiven Mizbeach Lefanav, they build a Mizbeach just like they did by the foot of Har Sinai. Vayikra Aaron, Vayomer Chag LaHashem Machar. And just as they had in Shmot Perek Daled, Moshe Rabbeinu had told them, after the sound and light show of Har Sinai, we're going to celebrate with a covenant, with eating, with basar, with sacrifices the next day. Aaron proposes exactly the same. And right now, this is a very religious event. They're at the foot of Har Sinai, 40 days after the giving of the Dibrot, 40 days after the revelation of God. They're now going to celebrate once again. Pasuk Vav, Vayashkimu mimacharat vayalu olot. Just as they did by Har Sinai, they're bringing their karbanot. Vayagishu shlamim, as they did by Ma'amad Har Sinai. Vayashav ha'am le'echol v'shato, just as they did by Har Sinai. Vayakumu litzachik. This is where everything went awry. This is where they're going to turn the entire religious, spiritual ceremony into a mockery. That's when Hashem tells Moshe, Lech reid ki shechet amcha asher helita meretz Mitzrayim. Hashem disengages from the people. They're your nation, Moshe. You deal with them. And Hashem, as we know, threatens annihilation. Pasuk Yud, Vata hanicha li ve'yicharapi bahem b'chalem ve'eseh otcha l'goy gadol. And Moshe Rabbeinu on his own is able to extrapolate that the only reason Hashem is revealing his plan of destruction is in order to elicit from Moshe Rabbeinu some type of response, a response of defense. Moshe turns to Hashem and says, I understand, Am Yisrael angered you, but you're going to treat them midah keneged midah. You can't contain your own anger. Hashem, what a chilul Hashem. What are the Egyptians going to say about you? A God of vengeance, a God of wrath. You have power to take them out of Mitzrayim, but you can't enable them to survive in the Midbar. And Hashem, I understand, if it's a lack of allegiance, of infidelity that was just portrayed by Am Yisrael, it's true. They completely cheated on you, so to speak. But you shouldn't necessarily leave them. You have to be allegiant to them because of their forefathers, who were extremely consistent with a relationship with you. Zochor la'Avram liYitzchak u'liYisrael avadecha asher nishbata lehem bach v'tidaber alehem arbe tzarachem k'chochvei hashamayim v'chol ha'aretz hazot asher amarti yitin l'zarachem v'nachalu la'olam. You had promised them not only a great nation, but that they would enter Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, Hashem, you have to stand by your word. And we know that Hashem says, okay, fine, I won't destroy them. In the meantime, Moshe is going to return to the people with the 2 luchot. And let's look in Pasuk Tetvav and Tetzayin and see how these luchot are described. Moshe carries the 2 tablets of testimony in his hand. Luchot ktuvim mishnei evrehem mizeh u'mizeh. A double-sided, or according to Chazal, written through the tablet. Hem ktuvim. V'haluchot maseh elokim. But there's something very special about these tablets. These tablets are literally the work of God. V'mechtav mechtav elokim hu. These tablets were written not only by God, but with the handwriting of Hashem. Charut al haluchot. They were engraved by God on the tablets. And then when Moshe sees, as we mentioned already, particularly the Mecholot, Vayashlech mi'ado et haluchot, vayishaber otam tachat ahar. That's Moshe's way of saying, you broke your written contract with God. So now what's going to happen? Hashem says, okay, so I have to fulfill my promise. Moshe's right. There is an unconditional shvu'ah, an oath that I have with the Avot, with the ancestors of these very rebellious people. So they are going to go to Eretz Yisrael. I'm going to send them with a malach. Here I'm sending a malach lefanecha, and the malach will take you into Eretz Yisrael. To which Moshe responds in Perek Lamed Gimel, Hashem, you told me to take these people with me. And back in Shemot, Perek Gimel, Perek Dalid, when you appointed me to be their prophet, their military leader, their political leader, their religious leader, you told me, "V'hotzeti v'hitzalti v'ga'alti v'lakachti v'veiti etchem ela aretz asher nishbati lavotechem." You told me that I would be successful in bringing them to Eretz Yisrael. So this wasn't part of the plan. I'm not supposed to take them with a malach. You have to come with me. But I'm not sure what you're trying to elicit from me now. Va'ata lo hodatani. What should I do? How am I going to somehow encourage you and influence? Again, I'll try to affect your decision. How am I going to make sure that you accompany Am Yisrael to Eretz Yisrael? Va'ata marta yidaticha b'shem v'gam ata tachein be'inai. Hashem, I didn't want this job to begin with. But now you have to follow through on your word. Vata imna matzati chen be'inacha hodieni na etrachecha. Show me, Hashem. Show me the way to restore a relationship between you and your people. Ve'da'acha lamanam sachen be'inacha ure'ei ki amcha hagoy hazeh. Vayomer panay elechu v'anichoti lach. Hashem says, firstly, Hashem says, believe me, you don't want me to go. Because as soon as Am Yisrael mess up again, then I really will destroy them. But Hashem says, you know what? My face will go, and I will lead the way. And Moshe says, Im ein panecha hochim al taleni mizeh. Because if your face doesn't go, if we don't have you, the presence of God in our midst, then don't even bother taking us away. Uvamei yevada efo ki matzati chen beinacha ani v'amecha halo belachtecha imanu. Hashem, show us that we're different. And make sure that your presence is going to accompany us to Eretz Yisrael. And Hashem says, okay, this I will do as well. Yes, Moshe. I wanted you to recognize that it's time for a different type of relationship, a new level in the relationship. So Moshe says, explain to me, show me your glory. How can I restore a relationship? And Hashem says, I'm not going to restore it to what it was. Instead, this is going to be a new level of a relationship. Vayomer ani avir kol tuvi al panecha. Hashem says, in order for my face to go with you, Bnei Yisrael, to accompany Moshe Rabbeinu, Hashem turns to Moshe and says, I need you. You're going to be part of this relationship. I am going to manifest my goodness, a certain side of me that you haven't seen before. Chazal explain that Hashem is now lifting up from a kisei, from literally the chair of din, of justice, to kisei harachamim. Hashem is sharing with Moshe Rabbeinu another expression of who he is. V'karati b'shem Hashem lefanacha v'chanoti et asher achon v'richamti et asher arachem. The first luchot were given particularly with din. Pokei avon avot. Hashem is going to remember our iniquities, and Hashem punishes immediately. And based on that, Am Yisrael really should be destroyed after the sin of the golden calf. But now Hashem says there's another aspect, there's another panim, another facet of the relationship, and that's one of rachamim. Vayomer lo tuchal lerot et panai ki lo yirani hadam v'chai. But Moshe, you can't see my entire face. You can't see the entire expanse of God. You'll never have a full understanding. But instead, v'ra'ita tachorai upanai lo yira'u. But remember that you will see me from one side. You'll see now the side, the back, so to speak, of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the facet of Rachamim. And based on that facet, we now turn to page 3, Perek Lamed Daled in Sefer Shemot, Vayomar Shama Moshe, Psal lecha shnei luchot avanim karishonim. now that you're part of this relationship, now that it's not exclusively judgment from God, but now Moshe is going to be interactive. Ana Hashem now tells Moshe, I need you and your panim for this as well. Now you can fashion another set of tablets like the first one. V'chatafti al haluchot et advarim asher hayu al haluchot harishonim asher shibarta. Ve'yeh nachon laboker, v'alita baboker al har Sinai, v'nitafta li sham al rosh hahar. And we're going to redo Ma'amad Har Sinai, this time without all the fanfare, but still no one is going to come up to the mountain. Pasuk Dalid, Vayivsol shnei luchot avanim karishonim. Vayashke Moshe baboker, vayal al Har Sinai kasher tiva Hashem oto, vayikach biyado shnei luchot avanim. This time Moshe brings his own tablets to God, instead of being handed by Hashem. Vayered Hashem ba'anan v'yitzatzevi Moshem. And the second tablets will be accompanied by a new revelation of God, Vayikra b'shem Hashem. Vayavor Hashem al panav, and Chazal explain that had the Torah not explicitly stated this, one could not say something like this. Hashem is going to, so to speak, wrap himself up in a talit and serving as a shliach tzibur, teach Moshe Rabbeinu how to evoke a response of rachamim, not just for now, but for all future generations. Vayikra Hashem Hashem kal rachum v'chanun, erech hapayim v'rav chesed v'yamet, notzer chesed lalafim, nosei avon v'pesha v'chata'a v'nakeh. Lo yenakeh. Pokei ravon avot al banim v'al b'nei banim al shalishim v'al rebeim. God is still a God of justice, but that's going to be accompanied by the mercy of Hashem. Hashem kal rachum v'chanun. Vayemeher Moshe vayikod arza vayishtachavu. And that's when Moshe realizes, that not only will Hashem accompany Am Yisrael now, but Hashem will always forgive. And Hashem says, now we're ready for a new brit. A new brit that's almost identical to what we found 10 chapters earlier in Prakim Chav Gimel Chav Daled of Sefer Shemot. Hashem repeats the same mitzvot of Aliyah LaRegel and the prohibitions of Avodah Zarah and the social justice laws that were mentioned, because now there's a new contract that's been drawn up. But it's not exactly the same as the other. The laws may be the same, but the interpretation is different. And this time it's an expression of the mercy of God. This time, man is going to be part of this relationship. And that's why Chazal understands, and certainly in the literature of Hasidut, we see how the second set of tablets have become the basis for Torah Sheba'al Peh, for oral law. As Chazal teach us in Shemot Rabbah, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu LaMoshe, Al titzta'er b'luchot harishonot shelo hayu ela aseret dibrot levad. Moshe Rabbeinu, you don't have to be so upset over the breaking of the first set of luchot. So even as we commemorate on Shavas Har B'Tammuz the breaking of the luchot, we recognize that maybe it was a necessary evil. Maybe it did have to happen in order to bring us to the next step. The luchot hashniyim ani noten lacha sheyeh behem kama midrash v'agadot tadu dachtiv vayagad lacha talumot chachma ki keflayim letushiyah. In the second set of luchot, we don't just find, as the Ramban said, Torah and mitzvah. We find all the interpretations of Torah Sheba'al Peh. What Chazal are teaching us is that the second set of luchot required the participation of man, the interpretation of man, whereas the first set was given by God and is going to be, as described also by our sages, white fire on black fire on white fire, very clear and evident to all. That's Torah Shebachtav. Now it's going to require man to interpret. Now we only see God me'achora, not the full picture of Hashem. So we have to extrapolate ideas. And the sages are going to, through the not only Aseret HaDibrot, but all the psukim of the Torah, learn from the second set of luchot that there's much more to read between the lines of the luchot. Or as the Meshech Chachma, Rav Meir Simcha Midvint, says beautifully, he says, this is what Hashem was trying to say through the second luchot. HaKadosh Baruch Hu charat et haktiva b'toch haluchot. ובכתיבה של משה לפי צורת הכתיבה שלו, רימז את חידושי התורה שלו. Hashem showed Moshe how to write the luchot. And the second set of luchot, it was Moshe who transcribes the words of Hashem. And any graphicologist will tell you, as you look at one's handwriting, you can see something about the personality. There's what to learn, even from the writing itself. And that's what Chazal say in Gemara Nedarim, Pso Lacha. The second set of Luchot, Hashem says, Ktov Lacha, Ma Psulatan Shalcha, Aktavan Shalcha. Not only literally sculpt the words, engrave the words, but leave some empty spaces so that you can read between the lines, so that you can also learn, so that you can also try to appreciate from the empty spaces of the Luchot. O Moshe haya tov ayin, u'misaran liYisrael. The second set of Luchot encourage man to be part of this relationship with God. And those are Pipulei Oraita, the give and the take. The Shakla Vitaria in the Gemara, Shanim Sarula Moshe B'Ktiva Zo. And that's the Ktiva of the second Luchot. The Luchot that then represent Torah She'Ba'al Peh. But they don't just represent another set of laws that have to be learned out from the Torah, that have to be inferred and elucidated throughout the Yugimel Midot Torah Nidreshet Behen. They also require much more Amelah Shel Torah. They require much more work. Hashem says, as opposed to the first set of Luchot, where everything was very clear and everything was very automatic, this time, Moshe, you're going to have to do something. I'm teaching you that if you want a relationship with God, especially after an iniquity, after Bnei Yisrael transgress, then you have to do something. You're going to have to call out, Hashem, Hashem kal rachum v'chanun. What we know has established the basis not only for all tefilot, but slichot, for all neviim in the future that are going to demand of God a response. But it has to start with man. This is the investment that we have, Amelah Shel Torah. As Chazal will learn from the Psukim, Vayomer Hashem o Moshe, Ktav Lacha et hadvarim ha'ele, ki al pi hadvarim ha'ele, karati tchem brit. Because it's these words. So the Midrash explain, actually on Parshat Noach, that when Hashem came to Bnei Yisrael, Hashem comes, Melech Machei HaMlachim, Shebachar b'Yisrael mishivim umot, ki chilek Hashem amo Yaakov cheva nachalato, ונתן לנו את התורה בכתב ברמז צפונות וסתומות, או פירושום בתורה שבעל פה, וגילה אותם לישראל. Hashem didn't just want to give us one set of luchot. Hashem wanted to give us the interpretation, but not alone. ולא עוד אלא שהתורה שבכתב כלולות, ותורה שבעל פה פרטות, ותורה שבעל פה הרבה, ותורה שבכתב מעט. ויעל שבעל פה נאמר, ארוכה מארץ מיתה ורחבה מני ים. We know that the Torah She'Ba'al Peh is extremely expansive. There's so much contained within Torah She'Ba'al Peh. And that's what is required of us, that we have to be willing to toil over this Torah. V'mi shememit atzmo aleha. Zota chukat haTorah, Adam ki yamut ba'ohel. And Chazal continue to describe the second Luchot as those that require man to work hard. Torah She'Ba'al Peh is more difficult than Torah She'Bechtav, shehi kasher lilmod, v'yesh bat tsar gadol, shehu meshulal lachoshech. And we know that Chazal speak about this on Chanukah, the holiday of Torah She'Ba'al Peh, that there's darkness. And the beauty of Torah She'Ba'al Peh is that we have to go searching for the light. On one hand, on Shavas Har B'Tammuz, we mourn Shvirat Luchot, but as the Rambam tells us, the point is not to look back at what happened on this day. The point of any fast day is to ask oneself, am I maintaining the status quo or am I changing it? Are we truly involved in the luchot, and that's why we're crying? Are we involved enough that we're going to take ourselves from the status of the second luchot and move onward? Well, today we know we don't have the first luchot that were in the Aron, and we don't have the second set of luchot that were in the Aron, because we no longer have the Aron. And this is what brings us to the second tragedy that we commemorate today, or one should argue the second pair of Hufka'ah Ha'ir, of the first stage that leads to the destruction of the first and the second temples. So now we're going to look at the relationship between these two temples. Chazal already explained to us the second temple, not as great as the first. Chamisha dvarim shayu ben mikdash rishon lemikdash sheni. There were 5 major differences between the first temple and the second temple. Ve'elohein, Aron, ve'kaporet u'kruvim, and that's even one. We're missing the manifestation of God on top of the Aron. There's no hitgalut elokit. There's no revelation of God. There's no Eish. When Shlomo HaMelech inaugurated the first Beit HaMikdash, there was fire that came down from Shemayim and it stayed there on the Mizbeach. That was gone in the time of the Second Temple. We had to light our own firewood. Ushchina, there wasn't a sense of the revelation, the presence of God, the Ruach HaKodesh, nor was there divine inspiration. And certainly not continuation of Nevuah, V'urim V'tumim. And what do all five of these have in common? These are all direct means of relating to God. The first Beit HaMikdash, like the first set of luchot, represents that direct relationship. At the same time, a very stark relationship. The second set of luchot, like the second Beit HaMikdash, is going to be on a lower level, but one that is not only going to bring rabbinic Judaism to life, but is going to require much greater toil. Albeit, we don't necessarily feel or see the actual panim of Hashem anymore. And the Ramchal elucidates this point as he speaks about Shlomo building the first Beit HaMikdash, and when he did, Shlomo built the first Beit HaMikdash completely aligned with the Beit HaMikdash shel Mala. Hayu shnei HaMikdashim shel Mala v'shel Lamata mechuvanim ze lazeh. That Shlomo's Mikdash represented a perfect parallel between the presence of God up above and the presence of Bnei Yisrael down below. But then what happened? V'kasher lo hitivu darchehem hayta ha'geula b'chashay v'lo atzru koach la'asot kebayetahu. But then came the Galut in Bavel, and we didn't have the strength to bring back that power of God. V'az asu oto al pi haneviyim shebeinehem. And then we had to work to bring the Shechina back. K'tzat omel harishon. And it was somewhat similar to the first one. V'k'tzat omel ha'acharon shekvar nitchadesh lamala. Efes katzeo lekacho v'kulo lo lekacho ki lo hayta ha'sha'a ha'ru'uya lekach. But it wasn't the time to return to that perfect alignment of the Beit HaMikdash up above and the Beit HaMikdash down below. But don't worry, because the day will come, we're going to need this transition of the second Beit HaMikdash, which is going to require much greater effort and initiative of mankind. And then maybe we can shift the alignment back. La'atid lo dai sheyu domim. We don't want to build a third Beit HaMikdash like the second Beit HaMikdash. And we don't want to build a third Beit HaMikdash like the first Beit HaMikdash. We want a third Beit HaMikdash that will incorporate man, but man's power that will be able to keep God's presence up above, aligned with his presence below. V'nimsa sheyeh HaMikdash b'sod HaKeter. And Chazal therefore see that there really is an association between the luchot and the Batei Mikdash, between the tablets and the temples, between the breaking of the tablets and the breaking of the temples. And this is elucidated also in the Gemara and Tanit, V'cheinu Omer, based on a beautiful pasuk in Shir HaShirim, Tzena ure'ena benot Zion, b'melech Shlomo, ba'atara she'itra lo imo, b'yom chatunato, v'yom simchat libo. Go and see Shlomo HaMelech. Shlomo on the day of his wedding, on his happiest day. And Chazal ask, isn't everyone's wedding the happiest day of their life? Why does the pasuk have to say Yom Chatunato v'Yom Simchat Libo? So Chazal explain Yom Chatunato zo Matan Torah, Yom Simchat Libo ze Binyan Beit HaMikdash. These are two parallel ideas, two parallel historical accomplishments, two parallel expressions of God in this world. God's wedding with us, Matan Torah, giving us the luchot, Simchat Libo, building the Beit HaMikdash. We're meant to see them as parallel, and therefore, when one is broken, we commemorate the other being broken as well. When the tablets are shattered, we understand that that breaks our wedding vows with regard to the building of the Beit HaMikdash. And Rashi points out, Zeh Matan Torah. Matan Torah, though, is not only revisited every Shavuot, but Yom HaKippurim shenitznu bo luchot achronot. That Yom Matan Torah refers to the giving of the first luchot and the giving of the second luchot. And obviously, Yom Simchat Libo is the building of the first Beit HaMikdash and the building of the second Beit HaMikdash. And what's beautiful is that Yom HaKippurim really is the tikkun for both. It's the means through which we fix, through which we revisit Ma'amad Har Sinai, through which we're offered Slicha and Mechila for Chet Egel HaZahav. But at the same time, Yom HaKippurim is also the time that we revisit and purify the Beit HaMikdash. And therefore, we're meant to see them as very similar. We're meant to see the breaking, the shattering of the tablets as a shattering of our relationship with God, as an expression of our broken hearts. But then the second luchot are meant to help us understand that we take our broken hearts and with this we turn to God and we say, we're going to be involved in reestablishing a relationship with you. And that's what we were supposed to do between the first and the second Beit HaMikdash as well. After the first beautiful, magnificent temple of Shlomo was destroyed, we were supposed to realize the second Beit HaMikdash as Chagai turns to the people, not to God. He turns to Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel. He turns to Yoshua ben Yotzadak, the political and the religious leaders respectively. And he says, come on, you have to be the ones. He says to build the Beit HaMikdash. Ha'am hazeh amru lo itbo Beit Hashem lihibanot. The people don't think that God is in their midst, but this time God isn't coming. Just like the second set of luchot, God is waiting for you. God is waiting for you to do something. Chagai comes and he tells them, Simu levavchem al darchechem, pasuk chet. Alu hahar ve'veitem eitz uvnu habayet vertzebo ve'kavda mar Hashem. Pano al arbei v'nei lema'at v'haveitem habayet v'nafachti bo. That you have to be the ones to change around the status quo. You have to go and collect the wood because this time God isn't going to come with fire from heaven, but the fire, the passion, the excitement has to come from you, which we know ultimately it does at the beginning of the second Beit HaMikdash as the people come to perform their malacha. But Rav Kook points out that as tragic as this is part of the necessary trajectory in our ultimate geula. He points out in a famous article, Mahalach ha'idiyot b'Yisrael, the process of ideas b'Yisrael. He says it has to start with God. Whether it's the first luchot or the first Beit HaMikdash, both of them, very godly. God is going to establish a certain precedent. God comes and reveals himself in this world. That's the Shmirat Torah u'mitzvot. But then, he says, comes the second set of luchot, the second Beit HaMikdash, that require more of the initiative of Yechidim, require each and every individual to play his role in establishing a relationship with Hashem. And it's much more gradual, and it's going to require Ameilah Shel Torah, and it's not going to be as clear as Torah Shebachta, but that will be Torah Shebal Peh. And he mentions, if you look in the last two lines, Zehu hachinuch hagadol v'ha'aruch. He says that's why this galut has lasted much longer than the first galut, because we have a lot to learn. And it's a gradual process. And just like Hashem said by the second set of luchot, you're going to have to daven. You're going to have to play a role. I need your face together with mine. So too, after the second destruction of the second temple, we find that Am Yisrael have to keep on learning. We just learned, based on the parsha that we read yesterday, Matovo alacha Yaakov mishkanotecha Yisrael. Chazal say that even without a Mishkan, even without a Beit HaMikdash, there are Batei Knesset, there are Batei Midrash, and that's our requirement today, to make sure that we continue to play a role, learning the Dikdukei Torah, Dikdukei Sofrim, Chadashim Gam Yishanim. He's playing off of another beautiful pasuk in Shir Hashirim. The Megadim Chadashim Gam Yishanim Dodi Tzafanti Lach. We have to come with the power and the glory and the aspirations of the first luchot and the first temple, but at the same time recognize that we have to be the ones to work hard, that we have to be the ones to learn Torah Sheba'al Peh. We have to gradually play a role together with Hashem that will lead us not back to a first temple or to a first set of luchot. Those will always be broken, but rather to an ideal where we can synthesize the two, where we can bring back the glory, the original glory and revelation of God in this world, but bring that back in a symbiotic manner. And the last component that I'd like to pay attention to is the aspect of Tefilot. We find that both the luchot and the Batei Mikdash, particularly the second set of luchot and the second Beit HaMikdash, were accompanied by Tefilot of Manhigim, the prayers of the leaders that allowed for God to stay in our midst, and also served to teach Am Yisrael what it means to have a relationship with God, even after breaking tablets and even after the city walls are going to be broken through. Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha, whom we're going to see in just a moment, according to Chazal, is Rabbi Akiva's son. He comes and he says that Moshe davened. What did he say to Hashem after the breaking of the luchot? The first luchot, he comes and he says, Hareini nat kvodecha. Hashem, I understand, psalacha, that you want me to fashion the luchot. If it's going to come from me, it's also going to come with a tefillah. Show me how I can restore a relationship between you and God. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu LaMoshe. According to Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha, Hashem responds to Moshe, Ani bati la'arot lecha v'istarta panecha. I wanted to come and reveal myself to you in all my facets. I wanted to come and show you my panim and not just my other side, my achor. By the sneh I came to you, but that's when you hid your face. Now you come to me and you want me to reveal myself? Kshebikashti lo bikashta. When I sought you out, you didn't want it. And now you want it, but I'm not in the mood, says Hashem. As opposed to Rabbi Yeshua, who explains in the name of Rabbi Levi, and he says, Afal pi chen heralo, that Hashem nonetheless answered Moshe's tefillah. And as a sachar, vayaster Moshe panav, particularly as a reward for Moshe hiding his face by the sneh, Hashem did show him something. Maybe not the full manifestation, but Moshe understood that we can never fully see God. Moshe understood that we can't live with the first set of luchot. We need the second set of luchot. And so too, I'd like to posit that Rabbi Akiva, who is so similar to Moshe Rabbeinu in many ways, not only in their careers, Chazal explained both of them lived 120 years, both of them started their careers at a relatively later stage, both of them had interesting relationships with their respective fathers-in-law and wives. Both of them were not only religious leaders, but military leaders. Both of them suffered losses of 24,000 students. Moshe Rabbeinu, we read yesterday by Baal Peor, and Rabbi Akiva, towards the end of his life in Mered Bar Kochba. But we also find that Rabbi Akiva responds to his breaking of the luchot, to the destruction of the Second Temple. B'sha'ah shotziu et Rabbi Akiva la'arigaz man kriyat shma haya, v'ayu sorkin et bisaro b'masrekot shel barzel. And the Romans were combing his flesh with iron combs. V'haya mikabel alav all malchut shamayim. And just like Moshe Rabbeinu, at the time of Shvirat Luchot, the breaking of the tablets, Moshe turns to God with a tefillah, Harini nat kvodecha. Hashem, show me, explain this to me. And Hashem says, you'll only see one side, Mayachora. You'll never see the panim. And Moshe, you have to accept that. And Rabbi Akiva learns with his tefillah. And what is his tefillah? Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Moshe Rabbeinu knows to accept, like Moshe, Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shamayim. Amrulo Talmidav. His students turned to him, Rabbeinu, Ad Kan, really? Amar Lahem, Kol Yamai Hayiti Mitztera Pasuk Ze B'chol Nafshecha. I always wanted to fulfill this pasuk, V'avtat Hashem Elokecha B'chol Levavcha U'B'chol Nafshecha, with every aspect of my life, of my being. Afilu notelet nishmatcha. Amarti matay yavo liyadai v'akaymenu v'achshav sheba liyadai lo akaymenu. Haya ma'arich be'echad. He focused on Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Ad sheyatzda nishmato be'echad. Yatzda bat kol v'amra ashrecha Rabbi Akiva sheyatza nishmatcha be'echad. And this beautiful Agadah clarified for me another Agadah that was always very difficult. The famous Agadah of Moshe Rabbeinu, who goes up at the time of Ma'amad Har Sinai, and he sees HaKadosh Baruch Hu won't give him the Torah because Hashem is busy tying the Taragin, tying the Ktarim, the beautiful crowns on the letters of Shin, Ayin, Tet, Nun, Zayin, Gimel, and Tzadik. And he says, Hashem, Mima Keva Yadcha. Who is postponing you? Who are you doing this for? And Hashem says, because in hundreds of years from now, there's going to be a tremendous Talmid Chacham who's going to perpetuate your Torah, Akiva ben Yosef Shmo. And he is going to, through Torah Sheba'al Peh, he is going to extrapolate beautiful halachot and magnificent ideas. Amar lefanav ribono shel olam herahu li, the same term that Moshe Rabbeinu is so prone to using. Hareini nat et kvodecha herahu li, show me this Rabbi Akiva. And what does Hashem say? Chazor la'achorecha. I'm warning you. Chazor la'achora. You're not going to understand everything because you're not going to see the panim. You're only going to see the achor. Chazor la'achorecha. Halach v'yasha b'sof shmona shurot. And Moshe Rabbeinu sits in the 8th row where the lower students are sitting. Or as we know in a Sefer Torah, 8 lines between every Sefer. Moshe Rabbeinu is, so to speak, sitting on the klaf of a Sefer Torah. And he really doesn't understand anything that Rabbi Akiva is explaining. Tashash kocho. Kevan shigia ledavar echad. They came to one point. Amru lo talmidav, Rebbe minayin lacha. How do you know this? Amar lehen halacha leMoshe miSinai. And this always bothered me. Why doesn't the Midrash just tell us? Again, what is this davar echad that Rabbi Akiva stuck on? And I believe that it's Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem echad. Ma'arich be'achad. Yatzda nishmato be'achad. Yatzda bat kol v'amra ashrecha Rabbi Akiva sheyatzda nishmatcha be'achad. Rabbi Akiva is explaining what Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem echad means. And that is Kabbalat Malchut Shamayim. That is the tefillah that accompanies our Shvirat Luchot. That every time there are broken tablets, and every time there's a broken temple, and every time there's a broken heart, we have to understand that we stay committed to God. And they ask him, Minayin lacha, how do you know this? And Rabbi Akiva says, Halacha leMoshe miSinai. This I also learned from Moshe. I learned from Moshe Rabbeinu what not only Mesorah is all about, but what Mesirut Nefesh is all about. I learned from Moshe Rabbeinu what it means to move on with the second set of luchot accompanied with a tefillah. I learned from Moshe Rabbeinu what it means to see only one side. I learned from Moshe Rabbeinu what midat harachamim is, but I also learned from Moshe that we don't always see the full picture. We don't get to see the panim of Hashem. Nityashva da'ato. And Moshe now felt better. So he went to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and he says, why are you giving me the Torah? And Hashem answers him, Shtok, kachala b'machshava lifbanai. I have the panim. You don't see my panim. You're not going to understand this. So Moshe then says, okay, heritani torato, her anischaro. Now I want to see what happens to Rabbi Akiva. Chazor lachorecha. Hashem already tells Moshe Rabbeinu, get ready. You're only going to see the achor. And sure enough, he sees the tragedy. He sees Rabbi Akiva as the Romans are going to pierce his body and comb him with the iron combs. And he turns to Hashem, Zo Torah v'zo schara, and Hashem answers again, Kach ala b'machshava lefanai. You have to be quiet, Moshe, because you're the one who has to teach people that they can't always see the panim of Hashem. That was perhaps the first set of tablets, and maybe the first temple. But we're not going to live with Luchot HaRishonim, and we're not going to live with the first Beit HaMikdash. We cry over those in order to make sure that we are going to appreciate what the second tablets are all about and what the second Mikdash and afterwards are all about. And that's a halachic system. And that's going to be a Meilah Shel Torah, the toil of Torah. And that's going to be the accompaniment of our Tefilot. And the proof is that in the Nusach of the Medrash of Eila Eskara, it's Rabbi Akiva who doesn't only say Shema Yisrael Hashem Echad, but quotes Moshe Rabbeinu in Sefer Dvarim, Tzadiku Hashem hatzur tamim paulo kichod rachat mishpat el amuna ve'in avel tzadika v'yasharhu. We don't always understand God, but we have to appreciate that God is just. That's basically what we're mourning and commemorating on Sheva Asar B'Tammuz. We remember Torat Moshe Rabbeinu as Malachi, the last of the Nevi'im, tells us, even after prophecy wanes. And we remember the Tefilot of Moshe and the Mesirut of Moshe upon the smashing of the Luchot. But we also remember the legacy that he left for Rabbi Akiva and for us. As Rabbi Akiva looked at the foxes that were running out of Kodesh Kodashim, and his peers and Rabbanim, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hurkanos, look and they cry. Rabbi Akiva bursts forth in laughter, and they ask him, how can you laugh? And he says, how can you cry? Because I appreciate that the breaking of one luchot leads to a second luchot. And the destruction of one temple leads to the building of the next temple. So if this temple has been destroyed, then I am now, again, sure with all the greater confidence that another one is going to be built. Because the past is not frozen, but the past leads us to the present. But we're not supposed to be stuck in the present. We're supposed to allow the present to lead to a greater future, a more difficult one perhaps, that requires the interaction of man, that requires greater participation in man with God in learning Torah Sheba'al Peh, that at the same time is going to be accompanied by Tefilot, a beautiful symbiotic relationship. We cry over the breaking of the Luchot on Sheva Asar B'Tammuz, as we cry over Hufka'a Ha'ir, to remember that one leads to another. We cry to make sure that we don't get stuck in the present, nor do we mourn simply the past, but we remember, as Moshe Rabbeinu taught Rabbi Akiva and teaches us, Psal lecha shnei luchot avanim karishonim. We don't have the first tablets, and we don't even have the second tablets. We don't have the first temple, and we don't have the second temple. But we have our Tefilot, and we have the messages that are still inherent in them. And that's what's supposed to inspire us to make sure that we incorporate this stage of Galut to the third stage, to not only restore ourselves to a state of the Luchot of the Rishonim and the Shniyim, where we can bring the greatness, the godliness of God into the world through our investment, but we can also allow for a third Beit HaMikdash that will combine the glory of the first with the participation of Bnei Yisrael in the second. That's Hufka'ah Ha'ir, that's Shvirat Luchot, the breaking of the Luchot, the smashing of the tablets and the temples to encourage us in our Tefilot to remember how we can catalyze and ultimately combine the best of both.